On March 8, 2023, 6 witnesses, including 4 veterans, 1 active duty Marine, and a civilian advocate, testified before Congress about the details surrounding the Afghanistan withdrawal.
I'd like to start with a question. What does an American promise mean today? There's a promise in the military that is both explicit and implicit. I have your back. We were trained that way. It's in our blood. In August 2021, the leaders who held us to that standard went silent, while our Afghan allies were left behind.
This is Scott Mann. He's a retired lieutenant colonel and former U.S. Army Green Beret with combat tours all over the world, including Colombia, Iraq, and multiple tours in Afghanistan. Sitting next to him is Aiden Gunderson, the young Gen Z Army medic you heard in episode 12.
The U.S. government may not have had the backs of our Afghan allies, but our veterans did. For as long as we've been a nation, our veterans have been a moral compass for doing the right thing, especially in hard times. As we try to figure out where to go from here, I suspect we're going to need that moral compass more than ever. You won't find many veterans sitting out here today who relish being involved in this Afghan evacuation. We paid our dues, and we tried to move on with our lives. I know jumping back into the quagmire of Afghanistan was certainly not part of my military retirement plan. But like thousands of other veterans across the country watching Kabul collapse on August 15, 2021, I received a phone call from a friend that absolutely crushed me.
That phone call was from Nizam, an Afghan commando who was trained by U.S. Special Forces. He was considered family by Scott and other Green Berets serving at the time after he volunteered for every mission and even survived being shot in the face while protecting U.S. Special Forces during a Taliban attack. Nizam was now calling Scott on his personal phone in the U.S. as the Taliban swiftly took back territory throughout the country. Like other Afghan allies, he and his family were struggling to get visas from the State Department and were now being targeted by the Taliban. Scott had retired and had been focusing on his own healing, which began with starting a nonprofit to help veterans tell their stories and writing and performing in his own play called Last Out, Elegy of a Green Beret. Last Out had traveled to 16 cities before becoming a film when COVID hit. As Afghanistan's collapse and the abandonment of Afghan allies became a reality, Scott and other veterans moved through initial feelings of helplessness and anger before finally settling on the resolve to fulfill their own promises to Nizam and other allies that the U.S. would have their back through the long haul.
Over the next few weeks, I assembled a small team of volunteers, mostly veterans from across the country, that we called Task Force Pineapple, to guide Nizam and hundreds more to safety. We didn't have any resources or battlefield access or time, but we had something that a lot of people didn't: relationships and trust. We used cell phones, knowledge of the terrain, and an encrypted chat room to guide at-risk commandos and their families at night, navigating through that suffocating crowd through an open sewage canal, and then into position to link up with known NATO service members like Aghan, who were standing watch near a 4-foot hole in the perimeter fence. Pineapple wasn't the only group. There were hundreds of ad hoc volunteer groups doing similar work, many of them sitting out here today. From breakfast tables to basements across the world. Jane, a Gold Star wife who lost her husband Chris in Afghanistan. Will, a double amputee fighting to save the interpreter who saved his life on the battlefield. And dozens, even hundreds more. We helped hundreds of allies, but thousands were left behind, and at great cost to this vulnerable veteran population who had already given so much. My buddy Steve, who was racked with post-traumatic stress and a traumatic brain injury from an IED, screamed into his pillow and pounded his bed because his children were in the next room. As his former interpreter was detained at a Taliban checkpoint and was pleading over the phone, "Steve, they are beating my wife. My children are watching this, for God's sakes. What should I do? Can I fight them?"
As Scott and other retired veterans were getting these calls, I was getting calls from fearful spouses who had spent years supporting their service member as they recovered from the emotional, spiritual, and physical wounds of Afghanistan. Now it seemed all of that work was unraveling in front of them as the global conflict was tragically ending over live stream in their living rooms and calls blowing up their phones. The efforts of Scott and other veterans through the Pineapple Express and other civilian-led efforts were nothing short of heroic. But their commitment to find and fund their own way back to Afghanistan illuminated a whole other level of integrity, leadership, and what right looks like. Against the backdrop of what General Milley has since called a strategic failure, the Pineapple Express shook me and many others in the country awake, revealing the startling breakdown of the institution's hierarchy, a shift in the future of humanitarian aid, and the power of human kindness. I was curious about some of Scott's thoughts leading up to the Pineapple Express, but I also knew he and his wife Monty had endured most of the 2 decades of the global war on terrorism prior to this moment. So I invited both of them to share their story of the days that led up to this moment and also their thoughts on what it takes to heal from here. I'm Corey Weathers. You're listening to Military Culture Shift, a limited series podcast on the impact of war, money, and generational perspective on morale, retention, and leadership. Thank you guys so much for joining me. It's such an honor. I have been following you for a while now, especially when the Afghanistan exit happened. There was so much turmoil and emotion that was just seeping through the cracks. I heard, like all of America did, about Pineapple Express. And so I'm thrilled to just kind of have you share a little bit of your story, how you're impacting leadership, and as a couple, your story of going through a good portion of this 2 decades of global conflict and then transitioning out and continuing to serve the community. So thank you guys so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'd love to start with you guys just kind of sharing a little bit of your story of your time in. I know that you were part of the SOF community. You had many, many deployments. Did you guys lose track at some point of how many deployments you've actually been through? Like, share just a little bit of high level what your time in was like.
Thanks for having us, Corey. It's really great to be here. We spent about almost 23 years on active duty, and about 18 of that in special forces. And we were married, throughout all of that. And we've been married now on Veterans Day as our anniversary for 28 years. And almost all of it was in the longest war in our nation's history. Mm-hmm. And, like so many of the folks watching or listening to this that were part of that long war, your phase of life was you were either in Afghanistan or Iraq, or you were getting ready to go back, mm-hmm. or one of those other hotspots. And that just became your life. It just became your life. You were either there or you were getting ready to go there. And everything revolved around that. Your leaves, your time off, your programs with the kids. And, for me, like so many other veterans, I was gone a tremendous amount of our marriage, a tremendous amount of raising our kids. And so for me, it did kind of run together. A lot of the trips were, what we call short trips over, maybe 45 days, 90 days. And I don't even know how many of those there were. There were 3 long trips, but that's what it was like for me. Is like, even in my play Last Out, my character is stuck between his fire base and his living room. And towards the end of the play, he doesn't even know which one he's in. And that's what it felt like. So what about you, babe? What was kind of a day in the life for you during the long war there?
Well, I think I didn't grow up in the military, so I didn't know much about the military, but I knew that they were gone a lot and deployed a lot, and there'd be things he did that I couldn't know what he was doing. And so I think I was just ready for anything, because I was marrying the military. So I was just ready for whatever. Obviously I wasn't expecting what happened on 9/11 and how that was going to change things for us. But I think because of the fact that I was kind of expecting, well, this is what it is, then I was able to kind of go with the flow with whatever he needed to do. I knew that my job was just going to be back home and do whatever needed to be done around the house with the kids and that kind of thing, and just try to keep all that in order so that he was able to go and do what he needed to do.
Yeah. And we did have a standing agreement from the time we got married. And I can't remember which of us brought it up. And I think Monty did, was that the agreement was the day that I didn't love it anymore was the day that we left. And that we would always remind each other that we had that option. And that was a really important thing as time went on and the war dragged on.
Did you have that day?
I did. Absolutely. For me, that day came, I was a lieutenant colonel. I loved special forces. I loved special operations. I loved my time in service. I'd wanted to do it since I was a 14-year-old kid. It was what I felt like I was put on this earth to do. And I loved every second of it, even the bad stuff. But once I made lieutenant colonel, I'd been selected for a battalion command that was not in the special forces community. And I was mixed feelings about that. But then at the same time, we had been conducting a program in Afghanistan called Village Stability Operations. And it's kind of a modern day Magnificent Seven. It was Green Berets and other special operators getting back to their roots midway through the war and really working by, with, and through in a serious way. Indigenous garb, living in the villages and helping these locals stand up on their own. And we had committed to that. We had asked the locals to commit to that around 2010, knowing that this was going to have to be a long-term program because they were really putting their necks out there to stand up for their own village against the Taliban, and that there would be serious retribution if we didn't, stay with them for 20, 30, 50 years with this program. And we made assurances, and we were given assurances that this would be the case. And so we made those promises. And then around 2012, 2013, we started being pulled out of these villages wholesale, Green Berets and other special operators. And the retribution was massive. Just about every elder that I recruited was killed. And for me, that was, as a Green Beret, where you are taught everything that you do is by, with, and through your partner. And then when you make a promise, it's a sacred thing. And to see that kind of retribution and the payback that those people endured was really more than I was willing to take on. I just couldn't live with that anymore. And so I declined my command. I declined 3 commands consecutive and was told on the last one that I was going to have to retire with prejudice. And I went home that day and told Monty, I said, it's that day. And I'd like to leave while I still have, an affinity for the military and on semi-decent terms. So we did. We put in our paperwork and we were out within 6 months.
Goodness. So many thoughts about that. First of all, in the book, I talk about 2011 being what I called this great culture shift, which really you can line up with the Budget Control Act and decreased funding. And you combine that with morale declining after going into, we're starting a second decade into this, right? And I know from a family perspective, families were starting to get weary. Families were starting to go, okay, this is a long time to have this tempo the way that it was. And even though, Monty, like you were saying, everybody was like, this is just what we do. I think there was a cost after a while of a culture, even a spouse culture, that was willing to just do whatever it takes. Like, there's only so long a human being, I think, can do that without there being some consequence to personal care, family care, and all that. So, but what I was seeing in 2011 was this shift. We had less money to do what we needed to do. So service members were getting frustrated. Like you're saying, Scott, some of the strategies were changing after that. I know the soft culture is a little bit different, and it can be a little bit more supportive and in person, especially if you're not moving as much as the conventional side. But what I'm hearing you guys describe is not only did you go through some kind of shifting of, even if it was just the strategies of what was happening during those global conflicts were changing, but I'm also hearing that you guys went through the shift of what happened at 9/11 and seeing what the community and America went through with that, but then also the various shifts that happened during your time through those 2 decades. So does any of that resonate for you guys? Did you experience any of that, or was it different in the SOF community?
There were several things that you talked about that I think were significant. So I'll address kind of the special ops side first. One of the things that happened shortly after 2011, I'm not sure exactly when it was. I want to say it was maybe closer to 2014, but in Afghanistan, there was a major shift to Afghans taking the lead And Operation Enduring Freedom changed. It was no longer, our military in the lead. It was Afghan military in the lead. That was a profound change in the sea state and the way things that were done over there. I think the other thing too that you saw by 2011, you had a lot of people kind of forgetting about 9/11 or people coming of age that just didn't remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Monty and I talked about that all the time. We went and gave, you remember I went and gave a talk somewhere down in Naples or Sarasota. And in that talk, we realized that a large number of those kids didn't even have any knowledge about it.
Was that recently or was that a few years ago?
A few years ago.
Yeah.
But I think it's to your point that it was just another culture shift. But I don't know, what was your biggest, like what was the biggest change when 9/11 happened that you noticed that was different? Because we were already deploying to South America and stuff.
Yeah, he spent, because he was 7th group, and so they were in South Central America. So he did most all of, like he had done some long deployments in Colombia. So we were used to long deployments because that's just kind of what he did with Special Forces. But we knew, I mean, literally the day the towers fell, he was at work at Fort Bragg and I'm at home, and we both just knew that everything is getting ready to change with what he does. And it did, and it did really quickly. It did. But the one thing that we had is he was getting ready to go to a school for a year, which is a good thing, because when you deploy as much as what he had, you look forward to those 10 months or whatever you got to go to a school, because they were usually just in class a few hours a day. They were home. It was good family time. So we had really been looking forward to that happening, because it was happening within 6 months or something. Yeah. And so, of course, the excitement of looking forward to that year changed, because right when we're getting ready to move to Maxwell Air Force Base to do that year of school, that's when 7th group started deploying. And of course, he very badly wanted to go and fight for our country. And so it ended up being a hard year, because he's watching all of his guys go over there and he wanted to be a part of it. And so
careful what you ask for.
Yeah. So get right back to Fort Bragg after we got finished with that year of school. And then very quickly, he had 2 back-to-back almost year deployments right away. We knew life was changing. And then, of course, they never went to Colombia again. You didn't.
I didn't, but the unit did. And the units, this was another thing with Special Operations Forces, was they were, particularly the ones that were apportioned geographically, like the SF units and some of the Marine Special Ops units. You had to go to both theaters. So you didn't get a break from, if you were going to Central and South America before the war started, you were still going there. And then you had to go to Afghanistan or Iraq, on top of that. And when you think about just in the Green Berets alone, there's 6,500 Green Berets out of 1.4 million people, 2 theaters of war, plus other global hotspots. The other thing I would bring up to what you were talking about, by 2011, the operational tempo and not just special operators, but the military at large and our families, the operational tempo was through the roof.
Yeah.
And our people were just decimated, and I think you really started to see that show up around 2010, 2011, about 10 years in. You really started to see, I'm sure you did, the effects.
Well, you deployed, the first year that he got, or almost a year, was 2004. And he went for a year, came home, and literally, I think it was 2 months when you found out you were going back. So he was home for barely 3 months when he turned around and went back for almost whole another year. Yeah. And then when he got back from that deployment, we had orders to go to Tampa to get him to work at SOCOM and do a joint tour. And then he got another job offer to stay at Fort Bragg, and him turn around and deploy again back to Afghanistan. And we had a long discussion about it. And we both knew that our family was just going to have to be first at that point, because it would have been hard on all of us. Yeah. And so, when he left for that first tour, our youngest was 1. And when he came back, he was 3 after the second one. And Braden didn't even really know. He knew his dad through pictures and that kind of thing. But when he got home after that second tour, we were literally, it wasn't when the SF came home, it wasn't like you go to the field and the
Right.
plane comes in and you're holding signs and the whole group's there, he would come in quietly and they would do their thing that they had to do to kind of get back home. And then he would call within a few hours and say, okay, I'm ready for y'all to come pick me up. And so me and the boys would just drive over to the parking lot and it would just be Scott walking out, and he's walking out, and Cody and Cooper, are older two, they just took off running. There's dad, I'm going. They took off running. And Braden kind of ran because his brothers were running, and he'd stop and look back at me, and I'd be like, oh, it's daddy, and then he'd kind of run a little bit more. I mean, he didn't even know who he was because it had been, he's 3 and his dad's been gone 2.5 years of that. And so I think that was part of our decision too, is we're like, we can't do this a whole nother year. We just need a little break. We can do it again.
This is in 2013, or this is then?
No, this is in 2006. At this time, it was 2006, and he'd been deployed basically 2004, 5, and 6.
So by the time you hit 10, 11, I was on my 3rd trip by then, and I think there were certainly men and women in the community that had done a lot more than that. And you started, I think you're right. I think there was a decisive shift in the culture for a range of reasons, and certainly social media was another factor. You're right. That's when it really started to come into play. And I think there was a lot more access to calls overseas, different kinds of calls, and those were put in to raise morale. But those had their own secondary and tertiary effects as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's any argument on this side that was definitely a decisive time in the war, and where we started to see a lot of change. I don't think we saw it. I don't think we were conscious of it at the time.
Right.
Everyone was running so hard that you just didn't think about it. I talk to so many people now when they look back on their life during that window of time, that our whole adult life, our young adult life, we gave to this war. And people look back on it, it's almost as like it's a disembodied experience. Like you're looking back going, wow.
I think that's what's so disturbing to me as a spouse myself, but also as a clinician. We're in 16 years, I guess, right now. And so we came in 2008. So we had a little bit of that experience of like the buildup and the community being really strong together, and everybody being as patriotic as they were and doing your part, and the families serving each other, and the whole block deployed at the same time. I had a little bit of that. Then we went through that shift, and I think you're right. And I think when you guys got out about to that 2013 mark, I think there was this continuing of plugging along. And at the same time, there's an incongruence that I think was starting to build as you were describing what you were experiencing, and why that was kind of like your day to I think things have changed and I'm ready to do something different. For those that maybe weren't in that place where they could retire, there was this incongruence of how do I continue to do what I believe in and what's really important to me, and the people that are next to me that are important to me, and try to get to that 20-year mark. And I talk about how COVID was this, what I would call a psychological breaking point, I think, in the culture. It was so hard for everybody across the board. But when you take that operational tempo and all of that repression that everybody was like, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's not, I can, like Monty was saying, like, we'll just keep plugging along. COVID hit, and it was almost like this false peak where it's like, I don't think we can do any more. Oh, wait, now we're leaving Afghanistan the way that we are. Right. So culturally, I saw those that were still in really crash at that moment. And so I would love to kind of talk a little bit, a minute, about the transition that you guys went through, because Scott, I think I heard you say on another podcast that transition was maybe challenging for you. What is that true? What was that like for you guys as a couple to transition out?
You want me to start?
Sure.
It was true. Yeah, absolutely. The one other thing I want to say too, just leading up to that, was that I want to be clear on it. I was pretty disillusioned with the senior leadership in the special operations community in particular. The way that we left the village stability program, the way that we communicated that or didn't, and basically to me it was a foreshadowing of what was coming on a wholesale level. And in fact, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but the play that I wrote just a few years after I got out, if you watched that play now, you would think that I wrote it after the Afghanistan collapse. But I didn't. I wrote it well before, because it was, to me and a lot of us, it was so obvious where this thing was heading. And just the zero defect mentality at the senior leadership level, the massive chasm between the leaders and the led. I couldn't be a part of it. I didn't want to be a part of it as a full colonel. I did not want to be a part of that machine. And so that was another factor for me stepping away. And I felt like my voice on the outside, because I still loved the regiment. I still loved special forces. I still loved the guys, the mission, but I felt like there needed to be some advocacy and some honest discussion. Because, and I'm just going to say, it doesn't bother me at all to say it. If you know, in the world that we live in now in the military community, you know, general officers and flag officers and senior enlisted advisors, there's these camps that you're in. And you're either part of that camp or you're not part of that camp.
Yeah.
If you're part of that camp, there's a pathway for you. If you're not part of that camp, we'll see. But in order to stay in that camp, there are certain things you have to do and not do, you know, and one of the things you don't do is you don't talk about policy. You don't talk about strategy. You don't talk about lessons learned in a way that is honest and candid.
What do you think about that now?
It infuriates me because we still have not done a comprehensive lessons learned of Afghanistan, of the withdrawal, of the impact that it's had on the special operations community and on our national security and on recruiting and retention. We haven't done it at any substantive level. And that's just one of many. And I really do believe that careerism in the military, particularly at senior levels, but it's permeating its way down, it is completely occupying how our leaders navigate the world. And so I do have a problem with it because just based on when I wrote Pineapple Express, the number of letters I got from former general officers who I looked at as practically surrogate parents just completely wrote me off. And it was kind of a, how dare you, you know, have this conversation, you know, and like it was disloyalty. And, you know, to me, it wasn't. It was an honest conversation about a failed policy and a broken promise, you know, that we needed to be accountable for. So I just wanted to say that because like that did inform my decisions. And frankly, when I got out, it led to a rough transition. Part of that was the way that I felt about the world I had just left, particularly the senior leadership, and coming into a world that I didn't understand, which was the civilian.
What was I want to be careful to not make assumptions on your story. What was it that you felt like you didn't understand? Because so many people go into transition, especially nowadays, that we hear that transition is really hard. And so people try to do what they can to prepare for that transition. And I have some ideas of what I think might have been hard, but what was difficult in transitioning to the civilian side?
Well, the really weird thing about it is that we even thought we had everything prepared to do that transition. Yeah. I mean, he had a job. We just bought a new house. We were moving to a perfect area. Where he was writing a book. I mean, the kids were still young enough and at home. We were still
married.
Yeah, we were still intact with our family. Yeah. I mean, we felt like we had everything in the most perfect position to be able to make that transition.
And on the outside, I really worked hard to try to make it look that way. And that was the first thing that I started to notice about my transition was I was really having to work very hard to make it look like I was okay. Yeah. I felt very disjointed. I felt almost like I was decoupled from not just the world I knew, but my own identity. And at that time, there were no real transition programs to speak of or anything that got you thinking about that. I just know that what I had wanted to do as a 14-year-old kid, which was to be a Green Beret, that was it. Never changed, never wavered. Now it was over at 41. And I'm thinking, okay, is that it?
What next?
You know, and so I guess I'll go get this contracting job. And I'm not knocking contracting jobs, but for me, it was certainly a step down in how I viewed myself and my own identity and my purpose and and I just felt decoupled. I felt like I was floating 7-8 feet off the earth with no tether. You know, I just was not grounded in anything.
Well, and I think you either mentioned a few minutes ago or I heard you say it on a podcast where you were talking about how, I think you actually just said it a few minutes ago when you said after 2011, like America seemed to forget They were starting to forget what was actually going on. And so I even had my own kind of institutional moment when I went to New York, and I was on some media about the book, and I left feeling so like off and odd. And it took me days to think about it, but I was like, I realize now how institutionalized I am, that I was angry that the media didn't even know what to ask.
Same.
Like they were so disconnected from the military that, number one, we're attacking the military, the very people that have been serving us for so long. Number two, you don't even know what questions to ask me. And I just was like, what is happening? And I didn't even realize how bad it was until I was out there. And so I had this moment of like, wow, they really have forgotten. And I knew that, but I didn't know it. So that was kind of talk about that.
And meanwhile, your husband and others are still fighting, and we have friends dying, and it was the same for me too. That was the other side of it, was watching what was going on in the country that I had left, and honestly, I would come back to America, prepare, and go back over. So I wasn't paying a ton of attention to what was going on our streets and in our country. But one thing that Sebastian Junger has written a beautiful book called Tribe. On homecoming and belonging. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Sebastian says is that, and it's even a line in my play, is soldiers are, people wonder why veterans struggle in transition. And he said, warriors are American warriors are more than willing to die for their country. The problem is they have no idea how they're supposed to live for it. And he goes on to say that the reason that it's so hard, how do you live for a country that is tearing itself apart along socioeconomic, political, religious, ethnic lines? Everything that we went over there to fight, to keep over there, had permeated, at least in my mind, as I was looking around the country. The race riots were starting to kick off, and the political environment was so caustic and corrosive, and everything was just tribal. And I thought, what the hell was the point, man? Like, why did I spend my entire youth over in this country? And now it looks as bad or worse than what's going on in Afghanistan. And I know, for me, that was a really difficult thing to come to terms with, because it seemed like no one in the country cared that they were deploying our young people over there. And at the same time, they were demonstrating the same kind of behavior that I had seen time and time again in those low trust places. So.
Yeah. So powerful for you to acknowledge that and say that out loud. Because I think there's a lot of people that feel that, but just don't either have the words, or, to your point earlier, don't feel allowed to have that voice, especially if they're still in right now, to be able to say what's happening within their soul. And I also know that there's a lot of really wonderful moments too that we can't skip over. But I think over time, I think what it really, and I think we'll probably circle back to this towards the end, is really what it comes down to is, you do all of this because of the relationships that you formed throughout, right? It has more to do with that than anything else. So I would love to talk about the Pineapple Express for just a minute. Can you talk through what those moments were like before you made that decision to launch out and do Pineapple Express? Because that, I imagine, took courage. It was a huge risk, but it's also the birthplace of leadership.
Well, we'd been out a while, and this was the thing that I did have a rough transition, but thanks to this lady right here, who picked my sorry butt off the floor more times than I can count, and just stuck with me, we found our way through it, and ultimately, not without some crazy detours along the way, to include, like, I want to be a speaker, I want to write a play. Oh, I think I'd love to learn how to act at age 50, and every step of the way, she says, okay, let's give it a shot. And it was hard. I mean, becoming a public speaker, I know a lot of military folks want to do that, but it was about 2 years of paying people to speak, and really learning the craft and working very, very hard, and starting from zero at a time when we had boys in high school, and mortgage and everything else. So the point is, on all that, is we had gone through a lot in transition together, and we had come out on the other side.
Yeah, we were finally getting to where we had been trying to get for 10 years.
For 10 years.
How did you know that you were at that point? What was different?
I think it was just because I was seeing in him what I saw when he was in Special Forces. He was doing something he loved, and you could tell. I mean, you can just tell that. And he finally had found what that was, and he had worked so hard to get into that space. And we finally were in that space and doing the trainings, and it just felt good, everything just felt good. And we were traveling,
and we'd always said we wanted to do that. We had always said that if we ever had a business together, that we would travel together.
Well, that was our goal, actually, because we had to be separated so much in the military. We'd always said when he retired, we wanted to try to do something together to where we could spend a lot of time together.
And so after several years, we finally got to a point on the speaking that I would go up on the stage and speak, and she handled everything because I was a clown when it came to trying to manage anything, including my calendar, just complete crap show. But, Monty could really run it. And so all I had to do was focus, and all she would let me do was focus on the storytelling. And she held space for everything else the way she had always done for our family. And we really loved that. And then with the nonprofit.
And we had a great team. We have a great team on our nonprofit, great team on for-profit. Just everything had really fallen.
The play was out there. We had done a tour on our own, 28,000 miles in a U-Haul van, raising the money on our own. And somehow we did it, and we had finished that up. We had made it a low budget movie on Amazon Prime, and it was just getting ready to come out when everything fell apart. That's kind of where we were. And I just think it's important to say that because there are so many people, and that's the other thing too. Yes, Pineapple Express was one of those groups, and I'm very proud of it. And we told our story, but there are so many volunteers who not only did they step up that were not Pineapple, but they're still doing it.
Yeah.
All these years later, they're still making payments on safe houses and getting babies born and delivering med supplies. They've cashed in their kids' college funds and, their 401ks. It's incredible what these people have done. And all of us had already paid our dues. We were done. No one was looking to get in the Afghan refugee business.
And are you saying a majority of those were those that had served?
I'm saying that, a large number were people who had served in Afghanistan or Iraq. A large number were still on active duty, and they were really in a precarious position because they had to be very careful, because they could really get in trouble over this. And then there were some volunteers who had never served that were just moved by it and they wanted to help. But the bottom line here is that there were a lot of groups that stood up, much like Pineapple did. They did not get recognition for it. We tried to tell the story as a universal story. And hopefully I've been careful enough to make sure that's known, is that like what we did was nothing special in the context of everyone who stood up. We just told the story. But for Monty and me, Braden, we have three boys. Our oldest son was in the Army at this point. Our middle son was graduating college shortly. And then our youngest son was about to start college. And I had made a lot of promises to that kid that I would be there for him because I'd missed the other two, And so all of that was in play. Our movie was about to roll out when we started getting these texts from Nizam, my buddy who was in the commandos, that he was on the run. And at the time, none of us knew what was happening, except that the government wasn't talking about it. Yeah. It wasn't really on the news. And yet the feedback that we were getting on Signal from the guys we trusted was, this thing's a house of cards and it's going to go any day. And that was the context of how it all unfolded. No one wanted to do this. It was a gutting experience. It still is. And I think if you ask any of these volunteers, they would tell you they would gladly walk away if someone would responsibly, from the institutional leadership side, take the reins and do what they're supposed to do.
So I'm so grateful that, first of all, that you did what you did, but also that you are sharing that other people played a part in it too, and that this was just one story that got a lot of the attention for it. And so that will definitely make it on this podcast. I just want you to know so that it's said. But what was the moment where you said, I have to do something?
There were a couple. For the most part, I didn't want to get involved in this stuff again. I had written the play on Afghanistan because I felt like we were going down this road and now it was coming true. And I, as I looked at the problem, like with Nizam, I'm a 9-year retired Green Beret who is specializing in storytelling. I'm not your number one draft pick for hostage rescue, and so I felt like if I get involved in this, somebody's going to get hurt. You know, somebody, because I'm not there, I don't have any authority, I don't have anything. And so if I start stomping around with this, somebody's going to get hurt or killed. You know, I knew enough about special ops and I had done enough recoveries to know that you start messing around with that stuff, you better have the access and placement and the capacity to follow through. And I felt like I did not. But yet here I'm watching my friend who's put in for his visa, has been waiting for a year. No one will talk to him. I've called the leadership at USASOC, at Army Special Ops Command. And not only is this dude a commando and a special forces, Afghan special forces, he had gone to the U.S. Special Forces course. He was a certified 18 Bravo weapons sergeant. He was part of our regiment. Mm-hmm. And I'm calling all these different commands on Bragg, and none of them are tracking this guy who was part of our regiment. Mm-hmm. And that for me was a real problem. It's like, wait a minute. We send these guys to our Q course. They're part of our regiment. And now he's in duress and you're not even tracking him.
Yeah.
You know, and that's for me when I started to think, okay, something's wrong. You know, these guys are not going to get, they're not going to get any assistance at all. And
these are guys that like have, I mean, he's here because a lot of these guys,
yeah,
you know, that saved our guys' lives, you know, while over there. So that's why I got so.
Monty, I was just about to ask you what that was like for you, because I imagine a lot of mixed feelings. Like speaking of storytelling, I put myself in your shoes in this story, right? I could just imagine being the spouse that's listening to my husband. That's like, something's got to happen. Like this is wrong, you know? And I could see myself on one hand going, well, what are you going to do? Like, what are we going to do? Like, you're out, you know, like, and at the same time, my heart is breaking because, right. But I also was getting calls from spouses that were also angry because they themselves were going through the loss and the grief of watching things starting to crumble. And they were also asking themselves, like, what did I just go through for like on the home front for 20 years, if this is going to fall apart? And so there was a lot of what I was hearing from spouses, a lot of repression on that side. Like, I can't even deal with my feelings about it because my husband, my spouse is going through something that I need to be there for them and figure out how we're going to get through this together. And I'll just deal with my feelings about it later. So what was going on your side as you're hearing him and seeing this tension start to build?
Well, in the beginning, I mean, I was just really proud that he felt so strongly about it because, like, we had our business built. I mean, we were doing a lot in our business, and that got pushed aside completely. I mean, it's as if we didn't even have a business and I knew, as important as our business was, to keep things moving. And he was like, no, I can't right now. I got to do this. I knew how important it was. And I knew how important it was to him. And that was enough for me just to know he's doing what he needs to do. And of course, when he's in Afghanistan or was deployed there, you know, all those times, you know, you hear kind of what he does, but I was living it with him. I mean, I was actually watching and hearing and everything, him making all these connections and doing these things. And I mean, I was so involved in it just from being there and watching him that I knew he was making these things happen. And that was enough for me to be like, yeah, I'm going to do whatever I need to do over here with our business to keep it moving, because he's doing some really great things here, trying to help our Afghan partners over there. And I want him to be able to have the space to do it. So, but it does, because I mean, he went like 5 days straight. I mean, not sleeping. Like, he would get in the bed and I mean, Mike would fall asleep 5 minutes and the phone would start going off and he would immediately need to jump up to make sure, because, you know, with the time difference, they're doing a lot of moving and all when it was just constant of him doing stuff. And so, but after, you know, he got Nizam out, and not I say he, but like the whole group, you know, Pineapple Express, they got Nizam out. And then when it just led into others and more and more and more, you know, then it kind of becomes, okay, where does this stop? You know, because there are a lot of people over there and you can't just keep doing this. We do have a business. And that's when it becomes, okay. And then, you know, you immediately thought in the beginning, okay, well, the government, somebody is going to step in and just take this over and do it. So we're only going to be doing this for a little while, and then they're all going to step in and be able to take it from here. And when that kept not happening, then that's when it's really like, okay, what is going on here? How do we do this? This is getting
Yeah.
expensive. I mean,
It
it's
almost crippled the business.
Yeah.
And you know, the thing is, even in combat, if you're in an operations center or you're running operations, you have different shifts and you work in different shifts, you know, or a emergency operations center for a hurricane with law enforcement and first responders. You have shifts that you work. Well, all of these people that answered the call, they didn't have shifts. I mean, they were working out of their living rooms and their basements and their breakfast tables on their cell phones, and they were staying up for untold amounts of time, you know, and doing the number one violation that you don't do in a war zone is you work for a certain period of time and then you come off shift and you recover. No one was recovering. So we took all of these men and women, right, who have voluntarily given us multiple tours, and they stepped into the breach when they saw nobody else was coming, and they worked for days on end, re-exposing themselves to trauma and things that they had seen, and reliving and new things that they're having to make decisions on, where little babies are getting trampled based on decisions that they made to the parents. And all of our veterans are going through this beautiful, fragile population. And I say fragile because they gave us what we asked them to give us, right? And then they go and do it again with no relief, no help at all for weeks. And how many, how many states of the union have we had? Right. And there's been no mention of it. The State Department in their after action review actually blamed veterans groups for causing chaos, you know, and when we know, I interviewed senior leadership, including Milley and others, and they said unequivocally that the veterans groups were the reason that responsibly vetted special operators and their families and others got through the line in that crowd of thousands who no one knew who was who. And I know I'm talking a long time on this, but there were several points along the way. The last thing I'll say on this is when I knew that it was like we were going to have to really kind of do this on our own was when I was talking to an active duty Green Beret who had worked with this group called the National Mine Reduction Group, NMRG. This was a very small group of Afghans that basically cleared roads for Navy SEALs and Green Berets as they would go on missions. They would eat the IEDs that were meant for Green Berets. That's how loyal they were. They were the ones who protected us from insider attacks. They were so trusted and vetted that they actually stayed with us in our own quarters when we slept. Just a few hundreds of these guys, right? They were completely abandoned. No one reached out to them. No one gave them a plan. And these are people who not only know our tactics, techniques, and procedures, but they know our names. They know our families. Like if they were co-opted by the Russians or the Chinese, this is a major national security risk. And this young captain from a special forces group is bringing this to me saying, sir, can we get these guys out of here? And that's when I knew, okay, nobody's coming. No one is coming. We're going to have to just do what we can and pray to God that at some point they show up. And 2+ years later, they still haven't shown up.
So how do you, from a leadership perspective, how do you move forward? So I'm asking for your wisdom from both of you. How do you move forward with hurt and anger? And that is rightful hurt and anger. The word that I heard and have heard a lot is betrayal.
Yeah.
In your congressional testimony, you literally said we're about to go through a mental health tsunami. And I, from the mental health side, can attest to that. I've gone through this similar anger, hurt, cynicism, and being at a place where, I teared up when you said that this is a fragile population, because it is. And yet they are the strongest, and most amazing community with such integrity. Your story is just one example of that. And it's why I wanted to write about it too, and share the stories, because you couldn't ask for a more solid, incredible group of people with outstanding character that even in the face of just such wrongdoing or abandonment or whatever was happening all over the place, that they still did the right thing no matter what. And there's very few people like that anymore. And so why that's kind of either swept under the rug or not handled, it just hurts. And so I think now when we have recruitment issues and retention issues, and of course we do, right? Because we were not talking about the right things. We're not leading in the right way. We're not standing up for the people that actually are needing to have a voice and to have that recognition. there is this overwhelming feeling of what do you do? What have you personally, both of you, done to begin the healing process from this? Because obviously it's still there for all of us.
I think
huge as the play.
the play's been huge for us. I think the first thing I would say is to anybody watching this is that, veteran military family member is our country's in trouble. Like we're in trouble as a nation for a whole range of civil society issues. And we need veteran leadership, military family leadership more than at any point in our history. We actually need what our men and women have acquired over the last 20 years. And I firmly believe that. I frankly believe that our military community is our last best hope for this nation, particularly the ones who led us through the last 20 years. They really do represent a moral compass, if you will, of how we move through this. And we need them in the game, right? And right now we are dealing with a moral injury that is massive. And, and I'm so glad that we're finally starting to talk about moral injury and the impact that it represents and get our head around it and start to move towards moral recovery. Because I think that until we do that, a lot of these very talented individuals are going to sit on the sidelines, or we're going to lose them. We are losing them. And I would say, and I've also been very vocal to our flag officers, retired and active duty, and our senior enlisted advisors, is we need you right now. We needed you 20 years ago. Yes, we needed you in the war. And maybe that didn't pan out right, and I got it. But we need their leadership right now to get through this moral injury. We don't need generals going to galas and saying, for everybody out here, you've been talking a lot about betrayal. I need you to knock that off. It makes you sound like a victim. I actually heard a 4-star general say this to a room of assembled special operators, and it's inexcusable. Like, it is inexcusable. You don't grind your way through this. There has been an injury of the moral variety that has been inflicted on a large number of people. We got to deal with that. For us, as Monty said, the play is a huge way we do that, is because by storytelling, just like you said, you teared up when you heard that. We listen autobiographically to stories. We're meaning-seeking creatures. So when someone tells a story, we locate ourselves in that story and we start to make meaning from it. And process our own lived experience in the safety of that narrative. We have found that the play Last Out in our workshops allows us to do that in a big way. And I really have to thank Monty for that, because she had the vision and the intestinal fortitude that when we first started this years ago to fight for that. And now on the leading edge of this tsunami, we're seeing the play really show up as a major asset. Not the silver bullet, but certainly an asset that is already in the game and helping people see that what they did mattered.
Well, the play is incredibly moving, and so is your podcast, for sure as well. And I know you offer leadership workshops as well, and so, which I will tag all of that for sure. Before I let you guys go, what would you say to leaders on how to lead? Because what we're having right now, we're having a mass exodus. Yeah. Retention is crumbling, and so there's a mass exodus of millennials who came in and were like, I don't want any part of this. Gen Z is like, I'm in just for my GI Bill and then I'm out, right? If they're even coming in at all. And for those of us who are Gen X, we are just barely limping across 20. In fact, my husband said to our branch, he was like, I need 1 year, just this next 1 year to get our kid through school. And then if you can give me this 1 year, I will give you 10 more years. But if you cannot give me just 1 year, like I'm leaving at 20, and we're already kind of barely getting across the finish line because of everything that we've been through. And so what would you tell leaders who have the opportunity to lead and empower and be part of the healing process of healing that moral injury? How do they do that and at the same time move forward? Because to your point, I think a lot of leaders are still with this mindset of we have to show ourselves to be strong with no vulnerability cracks. Empathy is a soft skill, like all that kind of stuff. What would you say is a way to heal the current force while recruiting the next?
What a great question. Do you want to take a crack at it? I definitely have a couple thoughts on that. I think, first of all, as leaders in the military and frankly, first responders too, I think this is true for them, is we need to get back to the realization that leading people, it actually is a privilege to lead people. We say that all the time, but actually living into that. And I think that honestly, I would like to see more leaders who are willing to lose their careers, if you want to call it that, who are willing to walk away from their careers, who are willing to do whatever they need to do because it's the right thing. I confronted several of the joint chiefs about the withdrawal in Afghanistan, and several other senior leaders that I'll just leave their names out of this. They know who they are. I confronted them like, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you throw your stars on the table? And I'm not coming at you, Scott Mann. I interviewed hundreds of special operators who were iconic non-commissioned officers and junior officers, and they were asking me that question. Why didn't you throw your stars on the table in the moment when we were asked to violate a moral code that you held us to account for 20 years? And crickets. And the answers that I get back from their handlers are, well, would you want to be in a military where our senior leaders resign every time they disagree with a decision? And my answer is yes, if it's immoral or illegal. And I think just start with that, and then when it comes to the force and looking at the force, people are leaving in droves. I mean, there is an exodus happening, and we're missing our numbers in double digits. This is a leadership issue. This is the careerism and the self-promoting agenda has finally come home to roost. And I think I don't even know that we can solve it from the inside, if I'm being completely candid. I think it might be that it has to be solved from, like Congress, but then there's a comforting thought, isn't it? So I don't, self-policing needs to happen. I think taking a hard look in the mirror, remember why you joined, and be willing to lose your career. But at a wholesale institutional level, I think it's going to take outside, the level of careerism that has permeated our military is going to require an outside institutional solution.
When you said that our older veterans, or the veterans, or even those leaders that are still in, that have been through the majority of this 2 decades, that still remember what it meant to serve, why we served, the people that we served with, the cost that we just went through, like those people with that memory who are now in leadership roles, that whether they're in or out, I guess, that can make a difference. I think it is with that wisdom and with that grounding of that kind of memory, we desperately do, to your point, need them to be the ones that lead the way. Because otherwise, people who don't know what all of this is worth, those are the ones that are leaving. It's like, I don't have any grounding or investment in this, so why not just go? And I think what's happening is we have so many people who are experiencing that moral injury, that out of their hurt, they're leaving, out of the betrayal, they're leaving. And what I'm hearing you say, what I think you're also saying through your leadership talks and your workshops, is you're saying, like, in those moments of hurt and in those moments of helplessness, which I think is what you experienced right before Pineapple Express, I can do something still. I have something left to say, and it may just be a leader going, even though I'm morally injured, I still have the ability to vision cast and do the right thing and call people to do the right thing and teach people about what that meaning and purpose is, even if you haven't lived through it yet. Yeah. Like there has to be some kind of vocal leadership of reinvesting yourself, which isn't that the hardest part? How do you reinvest yourself when you've also been moral injured by that institution in the first place? So I'll let you respond to that. And I know I've taken you guys over.
Well, no, that's okay. It's been a great interview. It's really tough to do that, but I know that it was something that I had to confront in my own life. And I know others that participated in the withdrawal had to do as well, was to look deep in themselves and say, who am I to do this? And as my old man always says, who are you not to, right? When you look around and you see that nobody else is coming, that institutional leadership's not showing up. This is what my next book is about, in fact, is about how do we get big stuff done when institutional leadership fails. And we can, there's a history in this country in the early 1900s when the country was at its low point, very similar to what it is right now, political division, haves and have-nots, infrastructure was failing. The pundits were saying America's on its last legs. A couple of drunks in Akron, Ohio, that had been trying to get sober for years, looked at each other and said, let's have a meeting. And they called it Alcoholics Anonymous. And the Rotary Club, the Shriners Club, the NAACP, Future Farmers of America, it all followed suit in that. Robert Putnam talks about it in Bowling Alone. And it was the largest period of bottom-up social reform in our nation's history. It lasted from 1900 to 1972. It was an upswing of bottom-up leadership. I think we're on the cusp of that right now. I think Pineapple and these other groups were the first shots across the bow. I think what you're doing in your book is a shot across the bow in a peaceful civic action kind of way of bottom-up leadership. And that's great news to me. It really is exciting because we can model what leadership looks like and people will follow. And this is the last thing I'll say to your leaders on this is what I found is that people, when they're in duress and when they're hurting, they follow leaders who are relatable to their pain and relevant to their goals. That's who we follow. And that means forgetting this soft skill BS and recognizing that we are meaning-seeking, emotional, social creatures. That's how we navigate the world. And you got to be relatable to people's pain and relevant to their goals. And if you are, whether that's an elder in Afghanistan or, an armor captain who just got out of the army, who's thinking about getting back in the game, if you can't relate to his pain and you're not relevant to his goals, he's not going to follow you. And for all of our leaders, whether they wear the rank or not anymore, that's what we need to get back to. Look at our tribe. Look at who we're responsible for. Am I relatable to this person's pain right now? And am I relevant to their goals? And if I'm not, then I'm not leading them. I'm just looking out for my own career. And that's what we got to change.
So good. I would feel like I failed if I didn't end with Monty. What would you say has contributed to your own healing and wellness through all of this personally?
I think our nonprofit work that we do, I think that's been a huge part of it. Because with the storytelling, with the play, with the talkbacks that we do after the play, and being able to hear the feedback of what the play did for them, how it helped them in the workshops, watching people work on their stories, and just being able to actually live and see that firsthand really helps me more than anything. It just
That's
really helps me a lot. And, with him, just watching what it does for him to perform the play and to teach the workshops, it helps him with his hurt that he has from so much, just, things he said, seen, done. I mean, throughout the military, outside the military, just being able to watch what it does for him in so many good ways has just been fantastic to watch.
At the end of Scott's testimony to Congress, he powerfully foreshadowed the truth of what was ahead.
This whole thing has been a gutting experience. I never imagined I would witness the kind of gross abandonment, followed by career-preserving silence of senior leaders, military and civilian. As a result of the way that we've left Afghanistan, we're on the front end of a national security crisis as 27 violent extremist groups are now operating on former NATO security bases with Taliban top cover. And I think we're on the front end of a mental health tsunami, as 73% of our Afghan war veterans say they feel betrayed by how this war ended. Calls to the VA hotline have spiked 81% in the first year since the Afghan withdrawal, and they keep coming. My friend Brad was found dead a few months ago in a Mississippi hotel room. His wife Dana confirmed to me that the Afghan abandonment reactivated all the demons that he had managed to put behind him from our time in Afghanistan together. And he just couldn't find his way out of the darkness of that moral injury. America is building a nasty reputation for multi-generational systemic abandonment of our allies that we leave as smoldering human wreckage from the Montagnards of Vietnam to the Kurds in Syria. Our veterans know something else that this committee might do well to consider. We might be done with Afghanistan, but it's not done with us. The enemy has a vote. If we don't set politics aside and pursue accountability and lessons learned to address this grievous moral injury on our military community and right the wrongs that have been inflicted on our most at-risk Afghan allies, this colossal foreign policy failure will follow us home and ultimately draw us right back into the graveyard of empires where it all started.
I will never forget the feeling that rushed over me when I heard about the Pineapple Express during August of 2021. In the midst of my own feelings surfacing throughout those weeks, I watched with amazement and confusion as these veterans lived out, in the purest form, the skill and character that the institution had developed in them. While it wasn't any more valiant than the thousands of other service members like Aiden and Andrew who fulfilled their mission with excellence and kindness, it was a startling and public example of moral leadership, character, and human kindness. It also revealed that I, and perhaps all of us, had gradually become more comfortable with the idea that institutions can't possibly take care of everyone and are often given a pass on broken trust and promises. Yet the power of a few together who were willing to do the right thing woke us all up to the invitation to do the same.
They follow the rules of engagement. They did what they said they would do. Put their lives on the line, hearts broken like mine, seeing what they're going through, sleeping on the pavement. Where are those rules of engagement? Geneva Convention had a good intention. From where I stood, we held true to that. We took in the wounded from outside the wire, under constant gunfire, but I couldn't shoot back. To follow the rules of engagement, we did what we said we would do. With lives on the line, hearts broken like mine, seeing what they're going through, sleeping on the pavement. Where are those rules of engagement?
The Military Culture Shift podcast is sponsored by New Res and written and produced by me, author, speaker, and military clinical consultant Corey Weathers. The closing credit song is Rules of Engagement, written and performed by veterans Anthony Wheeler and Maya Sharp with Songwriting with Soldiers. This is a supplemental leadership podcast for the book Military Culture Shift, The Impact of War, Money, and Generational Perspective on Morale, Retention, and Leadership. Copies of the book can be purchased on Amazon, militaryfamilybooks.com, and your other favorite retailers. More information, including graphs, data, and other resources mentioned in the book, can be found on my website, CoreyWeathers.com.
Put their lives on the line, hearts broken like mine, seeing what they're going through, sleeping